Title: War on the Ranch, A Legacy at Stake. Chapter 1. The Unexpected Roadblock. Jake Sullivan had just started his morning routine, plowing through the dirt roads of his vast ranch, when he hit the brakes hard. His jaw tightened as he stared ahead. Smack in the middle of his private farm road, a shiny red sedan sat like an immovable object, blocking his way entirely. His knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. At first, he thought maybe someone had broken down, but as he looked closer, he saw her, Catherine Monroe. Arms crossed, sunglasses perched on her nose. She stood beside the car as if she owned the land beneath her feet. Jake exhaled sharply, gripping the tractor's lever as he rolled forward slowly. Maybe, just maybe, she would come to her senses and move before he had to get down and deal with this nonsense. Of course, that was wishful thinking. Catherine didn't even flinch. If anything, she squared her shoulders like she was expecting a battle. Jake let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Morning, ma'am. Mind moving your car?" His voice was level, but irritation bubbled just beneath the surface. Catherine scoffed, flipping her sunglasses up onto her head. "Oh, so this is your land, huh? Last I checked, roads are public property." Jake took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He had dealt with this woman before, always complaining about the dust from his fields, always claiming his farm equipment was an eyesore from her pristine suburban neighborhood down the road. But blocking his tractor? This was a new level of ridiculous. "This ain't a public road," Jake said, gesturing toward the dirt path. "This is private property, and you're standing right in the middle of it. So I'm going to ask again, move your car." Catherine folded her arms tighter, tilting her chin up. "No, I was taking a nice scenic drive, and I have just as much right to be here as you do. I'm enjoying the view." Jake let out a short, humorless laugh. "Enjoying the view? Ma'am, you're parked in the middle of an active work site. You're blocking my tractor." Catherine smirked. "Maybe you should just wait." Jake's eye twitched. He had heard some ridiculous things in his time, but this was a new one. He rubbed his temple, glancing at his farmhands who had stopped working to watch the scene unfold. A couple of them exchanged bets under their breath, clearly enjoying the spectacle. "Look, lady," Jake said, patience thinning, "I'm not going to argue with you about property loss. I got work to do, and you're in my way. Either move, or I'll move it for you." Catherine's face twisted into a smug grin, as if she had just won some imaginary debate. "You wouldn't dare touch my car," she said, her voice dripping with confidence. Jake stared at her for a moment, then let a slow smirk spread across his face. "All right then." Without another word, he turned on his tractor's engine and revved it up. The deep rumbling vibrated through the ground. Catherine's smirk faltered slightly, but she held her ground, still convinced he was bluffing. Jake eased the tractor forward, positioning it carefully. The front loader came down, sliding neatly under the front end of the sedan. He lifted it just a few inches off the ground, enough to make a statement, but not enough to cause damage. Yet, Catherine's eyes went wide. Wait, wait. What are you doing?" she shrieked, suddenly running toward the vehicle as if she could stop it with sheer willpower. Jake didn't answer. He lifted the car a little higher, tilting it ever so slightly. The farmhands erupted into laughter, one of them even pulling out his phone to record the spectacle. Catherine flailed her arms like a windmill in a storm. "Put it down. Put it down right now." Jake finally spoke, voice steady as ever. "Oh, I thought you were enjoying the view." Catherine stomped her foot, looking around frantically as if searching for backup. "This is illegal. I'm calling the police." Jake sighed, rolling his eyes. "Go right ahead." She fumbled with her phone, her fingers shaking as she dialed. Jake didn't stop. He moved the tractor carefully, shifting the car off the road and setting it down gently in a nearby patch of grass. The whole time, Catherine shrieked into her phone like a banshee. Yes. This crazy farmer just picked up my car with a tractor. He's committing a crime. Send someone immediately." Jake hopped down from his seat, dusting off his hands. "There. Problem solved." Catherine spun toward him, her face red with fury. "You are finished." Jake tilted his hat back and smirked. "We'll see about that." Within minutes, a sheriff's deputy arrived, pulling up in a squad car. It was Officer Tanner, a man Jake knew well. The officer stepped out, taking one look at the situation, the tractor, the slightly displaced sedan, and Catherine, who was pointing and yelling like she had just witnessed a felony. "Officer," she screeched. "He picked up my car with that." She jabbed a finger toward the tractor as if it were a murder weapon. "He moved it without my permission." Tanner raised an eyebrow, then turned to Jake. "You damage it?" Jake shook his head. "Nope. Just moved it out of my way." The deputy exhaled through his nose, rubbing his temples. "Ma'am, why were you parked here in the first place?" Catherine huffed. "Because I have a right to be here." Tanner shot Jake a look, and Jake just shrugged. "Private property," he said simply. The deputy sighed. "Ma'am, this isn't a public road. You're trespassing." Catherine's jaw dropped. "Are you kidding me? He picked up my car with a tractor." Tanner nodded. "Yeah, and now it's out of his way. Doesn't look like any damage was done, so I don't see a crime here. But you are the one trespassing." Catherine's face turned from red to white. "This isn't fair." Tanner crossed his arms. "Well, ma'am, fairness aside, I got two options for you. You can move your car properly and leave, or I can write you up for trespassing. Your choice." Jake watched with pure satisfaction as Catherine sputtered, realizing she had lost. Without another word, she stomped to her car, yanked the door open, and slammed it shut. The tires kicked up a cloud of dust as she peeled away, fuming. As soon as she was gone, the farmhands burst into cheers, laughing and clapping Jake on the back. Tanner shook his head, chuckling. "You sure know how to handle a situation." Jake grinned. "I try." But in the back of his mind, he knew one thing for sure: Catherine wasn't done yet. She never was. Title: War on the Ranch, a Legacy at Stake. Chapter 2. The Retaliation Begins. Jake Sullivan had dealt with troublemakers before, but Catherine Monroe was an entirely different breed of nuisance. She wasn't the type to just take a loss and walk away. No, he knew she would come back swinging. And she did. The very next morning, Jake walked out onto his front porch and was greeted by an infuriating sight. "For sale" signs lined his property. Dozens of them, planted along the dirt road leading to his house. Some were neatly staked into the ground, others crooked and hastily shoved in, as if placed in a hurry. He stormed down the steps, jaw clenched, yanking out the nearest sign. Bold letters read, "Unwanted ranch property, serious buyers only." Jake let out a low growl. He knew exactly who had done this. Just as he expected, Catherine stood at the edge of his property, leaning against her car with an innocent smirk on her face. "Lovely morning, isn't it?" she called out, sipping on what looked like an overpriced latte. Jake held up the sign. "You've got to be kidding me." Catherine gasped dramatically, placing a hand on her chest. "Oh, you found one? What a coincidence. I just thought, since you clearly don't belong here, I'd give you a little help finding a new buyer." Jake exhaled slowly, reminding himself not to lose his temper. "You think this is going to make me leave?" Catherine's smirk deepened. "Well, it's certainly going to make things harder for you." Jake took another step forward. "Lady, I don't scare easy. And I sure as hell don't take orders from someone who thinks a coffee shop patio counts as ranch experience." Catherine's eyes narrowed. "I was born in this town." Jake chuckled. "Yeah? And yet, you sure act like a tourist." She huffed, her grip tightening on her coffee cup. "You may think you've won this little game, but I can assure you, Mr. Sullivan, this war is just getting started." Jake grinned. "Good. I was getting bored anyway." Chapter 3. The Battle Escalates. The next few weeks turned into a full-fledged war. Every time Jake tried to work, Catherine found a way to interfere. If he was out mending fences, she'd conveniently call in a noise complaint. If he tried to bring in supplies, suddenly the local delivery company would be swamped with fake reports about dangerous road conditions on his land. One morning, Jake woke up to find that someone, he wondered who, had reported his cattle as abandoned livestock, triggering an unannounced visit from the county inspector. "Sir," the inspector said as Jake leaned against the fence, arms crossed, watching the man scribble on a clipboard, "we've received multiple reports of improper livestock care." Jake snorted. "Yeah? Let me guess who filed them." The inspector sighed. "Listen, I get it. Neighbor disputes happen. But I have to check." Jake waved a hand toward his grazing cattle. "Look around. Do these animals look mistreated to you?" The inspector glanced at the well-fed, lazily chewing cows and sighed. "No. They look perfectly fine." Jake smirked. "Then I'd appreciate it if you'd tell her to quit wasting county resources." The inspector snapped his notebook shut. I'll make a note of it. Chapter 4. The Unthinkable Move. Catherine wasn't backing down, and Jake knew she was getting desperate. He braced himself for her next stunt, but even he wasn't prepared for what she did next. Late one night, as Jake was wrapping up his evening rounds, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. Might want to check your ranch entrance. Jake frowned, staring at the message. He didn't recognize the number, but his gut told him something was up. Grabbing his coat, he hopped into his truck and headed toward the ranch's main gate. The second his headlights illuminated the road, he cursed under his breath. A massive wooden fence, one that had not been there earlier, now blocked the entire entrance to his property. Jake threw the truck into park and jumped out, inspecting the fence. It was new, freshly installed with heavy-duty posts. And nailed right in the center was a sign. No trespassing private property. Jake clenched his fists. She had actually built a fence across his land. A slow clap echoed through the night. Jake turned, and there she was, Catherine, standing beside her car, arms folded, a satisfied smirk on her face. Jake ran a hand down his face. You have lost your damn mind. Catherine shrugged. You said this was your land, so I figured I'd help you keep it private. Jake took a deep breath, forcing himself not to snap. Catherine, you built a fence on my property. Prove it, she said smugly. Until then, looks like you've got yourself a brand new roadblock. Jake exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. You realize this is illegal, right? Catherine waved a dismissive hand. Details, details. I'm sure you'll figure it out. Jake was quiet for a moment. Then he smirked. All right, he said, stepping back toward his truck. You want to play dirty? Fine. Catherine's smirk faltered. What do you mean? Jake climbed into his truck, flicking on the high beams. I mean, sweetheart, you just declared war on a man who owns several bulldozers. Catherine paled as realization dawned on her face. Wait. Jake revved the engine. The roar of the truck echoed through the night as he shifted into gear. Catherine took a step back. You wouldn't dare. Jake grinned. Oh, I dare. And with that, he floored the gas pedal. The headlights lit up the wooden fence, the truck barreling toward it like a battering ram. Catherine let out a strangled shriek as the fence shattered into splinters, collapsing in a heap of broken wood. Jake rolled down the window, tipping his hat. Looks like your roadblock didn't last too long. Catherine stood frozen, jaw hanging open as Jake drove off, leaving nothing but dust and a pile of ruined lumber behind him. Title: War on the Ranch, A Legacy at Stake. Chapter 5. The Counterattack. Jake Sullivan knew Catherine Monroe wasn't done. No, after witnessing her fence reduced to a pile of splinters, he expected retaliation, and she delivered it in record time. The very next morning, he awoke to a sight that made his blood boil. His cattle were gone. He bolted out the door, pulling on his boots as he ran toward the grazing field, his heart hammering. The gates were wide open, and his prized cattle, at least 24 head, were nowhere in sight. Just as he was about to jump into his truck, he heard a car engine idling near his property line. He turned, and there she was, Catherine, standing next to her sleek white SUV, sipping her coffee with the smug expression of someone who had already planned her next 10 moves. Jake stormed toward her, fists clenched. Tell me where my cattle are. Catherine feigned innocence. Oh, Jake. You seem upset. Lose something. His jaw tightened. Cut the act. You think stealing livestock is funny. Catherine let out a light laugh. Now, stealing is such a strong word. I merely relocated them. Jake exhaled sharply, gripping the bridge of his nose. Where are they? Catherine sipped her coffee leisurely before replying. Oh, I don't know. Maybe they found their way to the old Miller property? Such a shame that old fence over there is so weak. Cows tend to wander. Jake ground his teeth. The Miller Ranch was nearly a mile down the road. His cattle could have spread all over the place. Catherine tilted her head. You know, Jake, it's almost as if your fencing is a safety hazard. Wouldn't want the county to hear about a negligent rancher letting his cattle roam, would we? Jake's temper snapped. You've got 5 seconds to tell me exactly where they are before I make damn sure your morning coffee ends up in the dirt. Catherine smirked, but held up her hands in mock surrender. Relax, cowboy. Your precious cows are fine. I just needed you to know that two can play this game. Jake glared at her for a long moment before turning toward his truck. He didn't have time for threats. He needed to get his cattle back. But as he climbed into the driver's seat, Catherine called out, "Oh, and Jake? Try to keep up." She slid into her SUV and sped off down the dirt road toward the Miller property. Jake revved his engine and followed, dust kicking up as the two adversaries raced across the countryside. Chapter 6. The Chase. Jake's truck rumbled down the dirt road as he followed Catherine's SUV, dust swirling in thick clouds behind them. He could see her glancing at him through the rearview mirror, her smirk practically visible even through the windshield. When they neared the Miller Ranch, Catherine suddenly veered left onto an overgrown trail, one that barely qualified as a road. Jake hesitated for a split second before yanking the wheel and following her. Branches scraped against the sides of his truck as he maneuvered the path. Catherine's vehicle bounced over uneven terrain, but she kept going, showing no signs of slowing down. Then, up ahead, Jake saw them, his cattle, grazing calmly inside a fenced pasture. Relief flooded through him, but it was short-lived. Catherine slammed on the brakes, sliding her SUV to a stop just in front of the gate. She hopped out, grinning as if she had just won a game of chess. Jake pulled up beside her and climbed out, fists clenched. "Move. Now." Catherine leaned against the gate post. "Oh, but Jake, this is my land now." Jake froze. "What the hell are you talking about?" Catherine reached into her bag and pulled out a folded document. "I may have bought this little piece of land last week. Legally, these cows are trespassing." Jake's vision went red. She had actually bought land just to mess with him. He stepped closer, his voice dangerously low. "Catherine, open this gate." She smiled sweetly. "Oh, I don't think so. Not until we renegotiate our terms." Jake exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. He had underestimated just how far she was willing to go. This wasn't just about petty revenge anymore. This was full-blown warfare. And if Catherine wanted war, she was going to get it. Chapter 7. The Standoff. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the field as Jake stood face-to-face with Catherine, the gate between them. His cattle grazed behind her, completely unaware of the silent war raging over their heads. "Let's cut to the chase, Monroe," Jake said, crossing his arms. "What do you want?" Catherine tapped her chin, pretending to think. "Well, I could use a favor. A rather public favor." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Spit it out." Catherine leaned in, lowering her voice. "I want you to tell the town that I'm the better rancher. That my property is superior. That I—" Jake laughed, cutting her off. "Not happening." Catherine pouted. "Oh, that's too bad. Guess your cows will be staying right here." Jake clenched his fists, his patience wearing dangerously thin. He wasn't about to grovel, not to her. Then, an idea struck him. "Fine," he said suddenly, stepping back. Catherine's smug expression faltered. "Fine." Jake nodded. "Fine. Keep them. Enjoy feeding 24 cattle. Watering them. Caring for them. Branding them, too, since you claim they're yours. Oh, and when they start breaking fences. That's on you." Catherine blinked. "Wait." Jake turned and started walking toward his truck. "Oh, and one more thing," he called over his shoulder. "You do know cattle permits are a nightmare to file, right? The county's got a 6-week backlog. You better get started." Catherine's confident facade cracked. "You wouldn't." Jake smirked. "Enjoy your new pets, Monroe." He climbed into his truck and drove off, leaving Catherine standing by the gate, looking absolutely horrified. The war wasn't over. It was just beginning. Title: War on the Ranch, a Legacy at Stake. Chapter 8. The Unexpected Twist. Jake expected Catherine to come crawling back within a few days, overwhelmed by the sheer responsibility of caring for 24 heads of cattle. But to his surprise, she didn't. Instead, she fought back. One morning, as Jake was repairing a section of his own fencing, a sleek white truck pulled up beside him. He turned, expecting to see Catherine's usual smug face, but instead, it was a stranger, a man in a tailored suit, holding a clipboard. "Mr. Sullivan?" the man asked in a crisp tone. Jake wiped the sweat from his forehead. "Who's asking?" The man handed him a document. "I'm here on behalf of Monroe Ranch. It appears that, legally, some of your cattle are still on her property, and she's decided to charge you boarding fees." Jake's jaw clenched as he scanned the paper. "You've got to be kidding me." The man adjusted his tie. "Ms. Monroe has formally declared that since you abandoned your cattle on her land, she is now entitled to charge you per head, per day." He glanced at his watch. And as of this morning, the bill is already well over $2,000. Jake exhaled sharply, nostrils flaring. This is a damn joke. The man gave a polite smile. I assure you, sir, it is not. You have 72 hours to retrieve your livestock before she takes legal action. Jake crumpled the paper in his fist. Catherine had officially gone too far. Chapter 9. The Countermove. Jake wasted no time. He gathered his ranch hands, loaded up his trailers, and stormed toward Catherine's property, ready to take back what was his. But when he arrived, his blood pressure spiked higher than ever. Catherine was waiting for him, lounging in a wooden rocking chair on her porch, sipping lemonade like she didn't have a care in the world. Beside her stood two hired ranchers, real, experienced cowboys, not the weekend hobby kind. They stood with arms crossed, making it clear that removing the cattle would not be a simple task. Jake jumped out of his truck. This ends now, Monroe. Catherine raised an eyebrow. Oh, does it? Because last I checked, this is my land, and these are your cattle trespassing on my property. I'm well within my rights to keep them until you pay up. Jake took a step closer, his voice low and steady. You're out of your damn mind. Catherine smiled sweetly. Am I? Or am I just better at this game than you? Jake clenched his jaw. Fine. Do you want to play legal games? Let's play. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. Catherine watched, curious, as he spoke. Hey, Sheriff? Yeah, I need you to come down to Monroe Ranch. We got ourselves a case of stolen livestock. Catherine's smirk faltered. Wait. Jake held up a hand. Oh, that's right, Monroe. You claim they're trespassing, but the county still has my brand on file. That means you're withholding someone else's property. And if I'm not mistaken, that's called cattle rustling. Catherine's face paled. You wouldn't. Jake's grin was slow and deliberate. Oh, I would. Chapter 10. The Sheriff's Arrival. It took less than 30 minutes for the sheriff's truck to roll up the dusty path. Sheriff Tanner, a man Jake knew well, climbed out with his signature no-nonsense expression. All right, Tanner drawled, pulling out his notebook. Someone explain what the hell is going on here. Catherine jumped in first. Sheriff, my property has been overrun with Jake's cattle. I did what any responsible landowner would do. I took them in, cared for them, and now I'm simply requesting fair compensation. Tanner turned to Jake. That true? Jake crossed his arms. True, except for the part where she stole them in the first place. Tanner sighed, rubbing his temples. All right, let's check the brands. They walked to the pasture, where Jake's cattle stood lazily chewing grass. Tanner kneeled beside the nearest one, brushing away the fur until the Sullivan Ranch brand was fully visible. Tanner let out a long sigh. Well, Monroe, I hate to break it to you, but Jake's right. These ain't your cows. Which means you're holding on to a property that ain't yours. That's theft in my book. Catherine's lips parted. That's ridiculous. I was doing him a favor. Tanner shook his head. A favor is returning the cattle, not charging the owner a damn ransom. You've got two choices here. You hand him back, or I start filling out a rustling report. And trust me, Monroe, you don't want that on your record. Catherine's hands balled into fists, her entire body radiating frustration. But she knew she was cornered. Fine, she snapped. Take them. But don't think for 1 second that this is over. Jake tipped his hat. Wouldn't dream of it. Chapter 11. The Truce. Or not. With the cattle loaded onto the trailers, Jake climbed into his truck, watching as Catherine stormed back toward her house. He half expected her to come charging at him with some last-minute scheme, but she didn't. Instead, she just stood on her porch, watching him go. And for the first time, she didn't look victorious. Jake sighed. He had won this round, but something told him the war wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As he drove back to his ranch, he glanced at his phone. A new message from an unknown number. Enjoy the win while you can, cowboy. Because next time, I won't be so nice. Jake chuckled, shaking his head. Catherine Monroe might have been his worst nightmare, but damn if she didn't make life interesting. Title: War on the Ranch, a Legacy at Stake. Chapter 12. The Next Strike. Jake had barely settled back at his ranch when another storm hit. He should have known Catherine wouldn't take her loss lying down. The next morning, as he rode out to check on his cattle, a strange sight greeted him near the far end of his property, a brand new "No Trespassing" sign hammered into the ground right along the fence line. And it wasn't just one. There were dozens of them, neatly placed every 20 feet along his entire property border, all facing inward as if he were the intruder. Jake's grip tightened on the reins. "Oh, you have got to be kidding me." He rode closer, examining the signs. Each one bore the same message: private property. Violators will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Catherine had resurveyed the land. With a growl, Jake pulled out his phone and dialed his land attorney, Mike Lawson. "Mike, tell me Catherine Monroe didn't actually manage to push my property lines back overnight." Mike sighed on the other end. "I was going to call you this morning. She filed a land dispute claim with the county. She's arguing that your old fencing isn't aligned with official records and that you've been using a portion of her land for years. Until the county finishes its investigation, you technically can't make any changes to the fence." Jake ran a hand through his hair. "How long until that happens?" Mike hesitated. "Couple of months. Maybe more." Jake exhaled sharply, resisting the urge to throw his phone across the field. "So what you're telling me is, she just locked me out of a piece of my own ranch." Mike groaned. "Legally? For now, yes." Jake clenched his jaw. "All right. Thanks, Mike. I'll handle it." He ended the call and turned his horse back toward the main house. If Catherine wanted to make things difficult, then he'd return the favor. Chapter 13, Retaliation. Jake wasn't about to sit around and wait months for bureaucratic red tape to unravel. If Catherine wanted to play dirty, he could do the same, smarter. That night, while the moon hung high over the ranch, Jake and his ranch hands set to work. They didn't touch the fence, didn't even step onto the disputed land. Instead, Jake had another idea. By dawn, a new cattle chute had been installed, right alongside Catherine's disputed fence, and directly facing her bedroom window. Jake smiled to himself as he patted one of his bulls on the flank. "Hope you don't mind a little noise, Monroe." By noon, Catherine stormed onto his property, looking furious. "What the hell is this?" she snapped, pointing at the large metal chute system that now funneled Jake's cattle through a path directly given her house. Jake leaned against a post, smirking. "What does it look like?" "A perfectly legal addition to my property. Since I can't use the land in dispute, I had to reroute my daily cattle operations." Catherine's nostrils flared. "You did this on purpose." Jake feigned innocence. Now, Monroe. I wouldn't dare break any laws. Unlike some people." The first wave of cattle bellowed loudly as they moved through the chute, the sounds echoing straight into Catherine's perfectly polished French windows. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "You want war? Fine. You've got one." Chapter 14, The Public Battle. Catherine's next move wasn't subtle. She took their feud public. A week later, an article appeared in the local newspaper. "Neighbor dispute turns ugly. Who really owns Monroe v. Sullivan Ranch borders?" The article painted Catherine as the victim, an honest landowner trying to protect her property against a reckless cowboy who refused to follow the law. She had even convinced a local council member to speak on her behalf, calling for a proper review of land claims in the area. Jake groaned as he read the paper over his morning coffee. "She's good. I'll give her that." His foreman, Tom, leaned against the counter. "You gonna let her get away with this?" Jake set the paper down. "Hell no." That evening, Jake went to the county town hall meeting. The place was packed. Farmers, ranchers, townfolk, all gathered to hear about the ongoing disputes, including his. And at the center of it all, Catherine, standing confidently with her well-rehearsed argument. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice smooth and persuasive, "I simply ask that the law be upheld. My family's land has been in our name for decades. We reserve the right to defend what is legally ours." The murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Jake stood up. "That's interesting, Monroe. Considering the land you're fighting over was never disputed until I bought the property next to yours. Funny how that worked out." Catherine turned toward him, her expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Sullivan, I'm only trying to ensure fairness." Jake folded his arms. "Right. So fairness includes hiring lawyers, moving fences in the middle of the night, and filing bogus claims to stall my ranching operations." The murmurs shifted. Now the room wasn't just nodding in Catherine's favor. They were questioning her motives. One older rancher, Mr. Dawson, stood. "You mean to tell me you suddenly had an issue with land you never touched until now?" Catherine's smile wavered. "That's not the point." Another rancher, Maria Lopez shook her head. Seems exactly like the point. Sullivan's been running his cattle without issue for years. Why's this suddenly a problem now? Jake smirked as he saw Catherine's tight grip on her clipboard. She was losing them. Then, he delivered the final blow. He reached into his pocket and pulled out historical land maps. These, he said, placing them on the table, are official records from over 40 years ago. They show my property line hasn't changed. So, Monroe, unless you can prove otherwise, this land stays mine. Catherine's face flushed red. The room erupted in murmurs, then outright laughter. Sheriff Tanner, standing in the back, let out a low chuckle. Looks like this fight's over. Jake tipped his hat. Pleasure doing business with you, Monroe. Catherine grabbed her papers and stormed out. Chapter 15. A dangerous escalation. Jake thought it was over. He was wrong. That night, as he rode back toward his ranch, he noticed something strange. His fencing was down. He jumped off his horse, kneeling to inspect the posts. The wires had been cut. His cattle were missing. Jake's jaw tightened. He knew who was behind this. But this wasn't just another petty move. This was criminal. Jake stood, pulling out his phone. Sheriff? We have a problem. And this time, I'm pressing charges. Catherine Monroe had gone too far. And now? She was going to pay.